Battles of the American Revolution is a series published by GMT Games, and it has been around for quite a while now, for over 10 years. It has 7 games published in it, and shame on me, I hadn't played a single one of those. So I have decided to rectify the situation by playing Germantown, which also is the latest installment in the series. The game clearly covers the anonymous battle that took place outside of Philadelphia and that saw the American army launching a surprise but ill-fated attack against the British army, and well, today I want to share some impressions with you. The series rulebook is only 11 pages long and it is very well written. The rules are clear, everything is very well organized, easy to find. So I believe that both because of the short length and just because of the very good organization of the rulebook, also there aren't any esoteric concepts, well then this is a series that really could work well at the entryway level in wargaming. A turn in the games of the series starts with the initiative segment where the players determine initiative. Then the phasing player will go through all the steps of a turn, starting from movement phase. Then there is rally phase where the phasing player will try to rally disrupted and shattered units. Then you have the defensive artillery fire phase. This is very interesting because in this phase only the artillery of the non-phasing player will be allowed to fire. So it gives you the sense that while the phasing player is moving units, the non-phasing player is just waiting there and getting the guns ready to fire against the phasing player. Also gives the non-phasing player something to do while it's not his turn. Then you have the rifle fire phase where both players can fire with their rifle units. Again, the non-phasing player always has something to do. It's very interesting. It's a continuous back and forth. You do not really have times where you're just rolling your thumbs and waiting for something to do. You will have things that you have to fire or to worry about all the time. Then finally you have the close combat phase, and close combat is based on a system of odds ratio, and once you determine the odds ratio of attacker and defender, then you will apply several modifiers before you roll to actually resolve the attack. Die roll modifiers for combat will involve factors that are typical of wargaming, such as terrain or whether the defender is surrounded or not, but here you also have a more original element, which is the use of tactics cards. These tactics cards will represent possible approaches that the armies can take in a certain battle. So you can decide to have your units turning flank in a battle, or committing reserves, or using flank, frontal assault, stand fast. The two players have a deck each and the two decks are identical. So the players will commit a tactics card at the beginning of a battle secretly at the same time. Then they will reveal the two cards and they will cross-reference the combination of their tactical approaches on this tactical matrix here to see what the tactical modifier is. Suppose, for example, that the attacker was turning flank while the defender was standing fast, then you have turn flank here and stand fast here, then it's a +2, that in this case is in the advantage of the attacker. Different combinations of actions would have resulted in different modifiers, no modifiers, occasionally no combat, so you really have to guess your opponent and try to figure out what is the best maneuver for you in that battle. This is a general view of the map. It is printed on paper, it looks nice enough, it is fully playable, functional, it really gets the job done. What you see here is also the initial setup for the game. Here you have the bulk of the American army, which is moving along this road, trying to reach the town here. You also have a smaller group of militia moving on the other side of the river, here along this other road. And here, of course, you have the majority of the British army in or around the town, completely unaware of the attack that is coming. And there are also a couple of other British units scattered around here, and they will be the first ones to experience the American attack. Like in other games in the series, one way of winning the game is by demoralizing the opponent's army. To do that, you inflict casualties, disrupt units, things like that. And each time you inflict one of these damages to the opponent, then the morale of his army goes down. And when it goes down to 0, then the opponent loses the game immediately. This game, however, also has some exclusive victory conditions. For example, the British player can obtain a decisive victory if he eliminates a certain number of American units. And the American army can achieve a decisive victory in one of two ways. If the American army does not panic, and I'll explain later what that is, then the American player wins the game if he occupies this X here, which is the road to Philadelphia, with a non-artillery unit, and if there are no British units around, then the road to Philadelphia is clear and the American player wins the game immediately. If the American army panics, then the American player can obtain an immediate victory at the end of a turn if he was the last player to occupy this hex here with Shoe House, and if he presently occupies this hex here, Market Square. If none of these happens, then the victory will be based on victory points, and victory points are gained by the occupation of certain spaces and by the elimination of enemy leaders. To talk a little bit about the specific elements of this game, well, the first one is weather. And since we're talking about Germantown, clearly we're talking about fog. In the first 3 turns of the game, the battlefield is assumed to be covered by dense fog. In turn 4, 5, and 6, the players will roll a die to determine if there still is dense fog, if there is moderate fog, or if the weather is clear. And then starting from turn 7 on, the weather will be automatically clear. Fog, of course, has several negative effects for the players. The main effects of the dense fog is that it limits the range of the artillery to 1x. That means that artillery can only fire to adjacent units. And also there is a penalty on movement. The movement points of the units are reduced by 1 if any portion of their movement is executed off-road or lane or trail. With moderate fog, movement is normal, but the range of artillery is still reduced to 2 instead of 3. So not terrible, but still not ideal either. To simulate the effect of the American surprise attack, the British player, on top of the limitations due to the fog, also has other limitations for the first turns in the number of units that he can activate. On turn 1, he can activate only units that are on or north of this X row here, and north, of course, is this way, so it's really not many units, as you can see. Then in turn 2, he can activate all the units activated in turn 1, and also the German units, which are these green units here. What can I say? They just have better reflexes. Starting from turn 3, finally, the British player can activate all of the units on the map. Just like in the historical struggle, Chew House can act as a fortress for the British player. The British player already starts with several units in there, and he can retreat some units from the front line before the American army catches them. He can retreat them in there, and if he does so, then taking Chew House can be particularly hard for the American player, because Chew House gives a very good defensive bonus to the units that are defending in there, so it might take several turns and the sacrifice of many or several units for the American player to take Chew House. However, deciding to ignore Chew House is not an easy choice either, because Chew House is right in the middle of the best road to the map, the one that gives the best and fastest access to the Victory X, the one with the road to Philadelphia symbol. Also, around here, as you can see, there is a net of streams and slopes, so the American player decides to try to walk around there. It will be slowed down by the terrain. Add the penalty given by the fog to movement off-road, then it's even worse. Well, you can use these trails here, but they go in a completely different direction, so they still will force the American player to take a long detour. So whichever way the American player will decide to go about Chew House, interesting situations will arise and hard choices will need to be made. On turn 2, the American player will receive quite a few reinforcements. These reinforcements will enter the map from the eastern edge, and they will move along this road. The problem is this small stack of units here that represents Stephen's division, because simply and sadly enough, Stephen that fateful morning was completely drunk, and therefore he was completely unable to guide his men in any rational way. To simulate that, at the beginning of each turn, the American player will roll on a specific table, and that table will determine the general direction of Stephen's division's movement. So he might start moving this way, and then go back here, and he may circling and meandering all around. The American player just has no or very limited control over Stephen's division, so you cannot really count on them as an active force for the battle. And if by any chance Stephen's division joins the main army, that is not going to be a moment to celebrate. In fact, that division could just create so much confusion that if any units in Stephen's division ends its movement adjacent to or stacked with units from the rest of the American army, then a friendly fire incident may occur. So if units from Stevens are adjacent to or stacked with, all units, both Stevens and the units from the rest of the army involved in the contact, need to roll on a specific table. One of the possible results is the friendly fire incident. The friendly fire incident sends the entire army in panic. The panic is that situation that I mentioned briefly earlier that changes the victory conditions. It also lowers the morale of the army. Units that are directly involved in the panic situation need to retreat. They also cannot fire, they cannot move, they cannot attack. It's really bad. They do not have zone of control. They can do pretty much anything. Luckily enough, they can recover later, but trust me, they will not have particularly nice memories of the moment in which Stephen joined the battle. The game starts somewhat slowly because in the first couple of turns the players do not have many choices. The British player cannot activate most of his army, so more or less all he can do is try to withdraw units and regroup and probably take control of Chew House and prepare defense there. The American player, because of the fog, cannot really afford to move off-road, and so pretty much has a very narrow path where he can go, and he needs to go toward Germantown because the objectives are there. So more or less the first couple of turns, all the American player can do is to redistribute units along the line in order to prepare good attacks for later without violating the stacking limits. There are other approaches, but more or less pretty much this is what will happen many times. Then starting from turn 3 or 4, where the whole of the British army enters the fight, then definitely more things happen. But do not underestimate the first turns. Positioning your units well in those 2 turns where apparently not much happens is extremely important. I've seen several times that the first clash of the 2 armies in turn 3 or 4 can be fatal. If the forces of one of the 2 armies are not well distributed, if there is a strong section of one army that starts bashing a weak section of the other army, in 1 or 2 turns that section of the battle can do so much damage to one of the 2 armies to actually make that damage irreversible. And sometimes I see the battle starting at turn 4 and the game was virtually over by the end of turn 5, with one of the 2 armies completely demoralized. However, if the 2 players manage to keep things balanced to survive the first strong impact between the 2 armies, then things get very interesting. Then you have a battle where there will be more units joining from different directions, where the terrain will present interesting challenges, whether there's the fog or not, and the fog of course creates another layer of depth, where just there are more options and things that can happen that you would expect from a game that has only one scenario and such a strong setup, such a very well-defined setup, and almost a script for the first couple of turns. Yet later things develop in a variety of interesting ways. The game is engaging. I like the general system of the series. It's the first time I played, but I really was won over by this continuous alternance between phasing, non-phasing, the fact that you can act or fire and attack in all phases. It just keeps things interesting. However, speaking of Germantown more specifically, I think it is a very fun game. I do not mind the fact that there's only one scenario. I found that I still could get enough different experiences out of it that it kept me want to play it more. Definitely convinced me to try more games in the series, and as you can imagine, as soon as I do that, I will report back to you in my videos.